again, I'm not a Catholic basher. It's a very diverse group of people, but there's no doubt that this new pope, I mean, might as well be, Lenin or something. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, and look, the stuff he's saying is basically the opposite of the last pope. So I don't want to hear all this business that I'm just bashing popes here. I mean, this guy is really pushing it. And he's an admitted socialist, Jesuit, Leninist, Marxist. God help us. I mean, it's just on every front. And you got the Protestant churches pushing the same garbage. I mean, evil is making its move. That's all I know.
Welcome to the Magnificast. I'm Dean.
I'm Matt.
The Magnificast is a podcast where we talk about Christianity and leftist politics. So this week we're talking with Derek Ford, who's a real-life communist. Derek is an American organizer and a scholar who does some work on communist education and contemporary philosophy. So what I like most about Derek is that he builds a lot of really interesting bridges in his work. So, for example, like historically, communists and certain philosophers like Foucault or Judith Butler or whatever don't really get along. But Derek tries really hard to think them together, and he does it with these practical problems in mind, like how would you actually organize labor. So when Matt and I were thinking about guests to invite onto the podcast, where we're trying to explore the bridges between Christianity and leftism, Derek seemed like a really obvious choice. So specifically, Derek wrote this paper about why people should join Communist Party movements, and I read it and I emailed Derek, basically asking him to convince me to join a party. So I'm kind of in part taking him up on that in this podcast. So Derek's latest book is Communist Study, Education for the Commons, and you should all pick up a copy and read it, or email someone you know for a PDF of it. Now you want to turn the lights down low, grab yourself the nearest pacifier, because it's party time.
So, Dean, what have you been up to over the last week?
Actually, don't start with me because I'm I'm getting my nervous jitters out.
Okay, that's fine. So, Derek, what have you been up to?
Let's see. So last Monday, I was in D.C. Meeting with a delegation from South Korea. They formed a new political party there called the People's Democracy Party, and they sent a peace delegation over. There's been a lot of repression. They had another opposition party called the Unified Progressive Party that the current government, now the sort of impeached president Park Geun-hye had repressed. She banned it and imprisoned its leaders and everything. So they formed this new party. So they sent a peace delegation over. I was meeting with them on Monday and Tuesday, and then teaching classes. And then there was a Philosophy of Education Society conference in Seattle that I went to for a couple of days.
Well, that's awesome. That's really legit. I'm a teacher too, so I've just been teaching classes and trying to stay alive. That's basically all I've been doing this last week. And catching up on grading. That's pretty nuts.
Yeah, that's legit too.
It's all right. Dean, what about you?
I'm not a teacher, and I did not go on any delegations. I made a lot of coffee this week at my job, and I read some good books. I've been trying to read Derek's book feverishly in the last week, while also desperately trying to think up things to report on for my job as a journalist at America Magazine. So, yeah, also treading water right now with too many responsibilities, I think. So, in a survivalist mode, but not for any interesting reasons.
Yeah, man, that's rough. It's a lot of stuff going on.
That's fine.
Good. So one of the weirdest. So I've been teaching. That's what I said. One of the weirdest things I have to do and teach is public relations. I don't really have any public relations experience. That's not my jam. at all, but I have to cover the course because we don't have a faculty member for it. So I've been making all of these really funny public relations like role-playing games for my students to work through. Over the last week, though, I gave them one where they had to deal with a situation of unionization at like a big company, and it's been really funny to see them like work out that problem in sort of a public relations framework. They have no idea what unions are even for, which is very troubling, but it's been fun. It's been a good time.
What are some of the most interesting responses to unions without knowing what unions are for?
Yesterday, they were like working through the problem in class, and one of the girls in the class, she's very fierce and like is so good at research, but she had like no idea really what unions did. So she was she was like just Googling it, and she was like, well, like, do unions have anything to do with healthcare? And she's like, oh yeah, they do. Just like, like complete like just like no imagination about, or like no imagination and no like understanding, I guess, of like what unionization is about in general. So it's been like a fun project to sort of make them think about those things, I guess. What a weird thing.
That's cool.
Yeah. It's been all right.
So Derek, I want to ask you specifically just a question to sort of start getting us on the track of thinking a little bit about your work. So you mentioned that you're not a theologian several times in our conversation, which is totally fine. But nevertheless, I'm going to pose to you the question, why should Christians specifically join a communist party?
Well, I think that ultimately the Communist Party is... it's oriented towards, its whole purpose is for, realizing the conditions of the kingdom of God on earth, like, as soon as possible. Creating structures that are non-exploitative and free of domination. So there's a new Althusser documentary out called like Althusser, An Intellectual Life or something. And there's this clip of him. He's on, some rooftop in Rome being interviewed. I think it's like 1981 or something like that. And they're asking him, they're like, so why did you become a communist? And he's like, well, I was a Catholic, so it was really like quite natural for me. And the way he said it was like, in which was like, yeah, like, okay, like there's no really explanation needed for it. There weren't any like follow-up questions. It was kind of like the most natural thing. Like, yeah, well, I was a Catholic, so obviously I was a communist. And then like, let's move on from there. And so I like that. And I hope that would be the normal response at some point, the typical response.
Yeah, I also hope that would be a typical response at some point, very, very desperately.
That's so funny.
Is it true to say that like we're trying to create the kingdom of God on earth? Or is that like blasphemy?
I guess that depends on who you ask. There's obviously a large contingent of Christians who see the kingdom of God as purely immaterial. It's this thing that you go to when you die. It doesn't really have any bearing on what happens here. But there's a long tradition of Christians also saying that, well, even though the kingdom of God might somehow, belong to God and belong somewhere else or whatever, it also is already here. Jesus himself says that the kingdom of God is in your midst, which is something that like Tolstoy was really obsessed with, going back to over and over again. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's putting it too strongly. I don't know, some Christians will probably get upset about that, but I think it's really exciting.
Yeah,
I think one way in which to think about it is if God is within us, then the Communist Party tries to organize that sort of internal, like trans-individual internality, and tries to organize it and to make it into a sort of like social condition.
I think that's really helpful because, just coming from out of evangelicalism, a huge problem is just organization, and that there's not like the rejection of church hierarchy is definitely part of Protestant Christianity, and in that rejection we don't replace it with anything very good. So maybe that would be like another good inroad for the party structure in Christianity, that it's like a different type of organization. It's the introduction of something that's social oriented, justice oriented. It sounds good to me. I also like that Althusser was just like, I was a Catholic and now I'm a communist, enough said. Like, that was the end of the conversation. I appreciate that, actually. That's very nice.
Yeah, me too.
So many Christians, like, spend their time wringing their hands about joining parties and, like, engaging with politics, and they think they need, like, some type of hard biblical groundwork for it or something. But Althusser, and like others, too, are just like, yeah, it's fine. I'm also a communist. Are you a part of a party? Just wondering.
I'm not a part of a party. Not a formal party.
Are you part of any informal parties?
Yeah, variety. I'm a regular party goer. I go to a lot of parties.
And Derek, are you part of a party?
Yeah, I'm a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and I've been I joined as a candidate member. We all enter as candidate members in 2007.
Okay, that's pretty cool. Party for Socialism and Liberation's kind of a big deal. It's a pretty big and national party. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so we were formed in 2004 with basically a handful of people gathered in San Francisco when, conditions were not necessarily like super ripe for the, rebirth of a vibrant socialist movement, but nonetheless, we felt that it was necessary to really start a new party for a new moment, and that we knew that an economic crisis was coming, and we wanted to be prepared for it and to start building really an infrastructure that was not just about ideology but really about fighting. We looked around, and many of the parties existing had sort of become shells of themselves, since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the dissolution of the socialist bloc countries, many of them were just sort of reduced to putting out a newspaper every once in a while, or doing sort of the same old things over and over again. And so we wanted to start a new Marxist-Leninist party, and that's what we did. And from the very beginning, we were really focused on recruiting and training young people, young workers, people of color, people from oppressed communities in the United States, to become leaders, to become a new generation that would lead the various, sort of mass movements, social struggles in the United States. And I think that, we've definitely been successful. We've definitely grown a lot. We've built a lot. We definitely have, we're very proud of the organizing that we've done. We're definitely, I think, with the most active party in the United States, and the most active. We're in the streets the most. We do, I think, the most organizing. We really try not to just talk on Facebook, and in fact, we make a point not to do that. And we're really, really focused on building and recruiting and bringing people to the left. So oftentimes, we're obviously part of the left, so we talk to the left, but the left, in a sense, isn't like our main audience. Our main audience are workers and people who are of course affected by capitalism and white supremacy and imperialism, but aren't already part of an established left.
Yeah, that's awesome. What I appreciate about the PSL so much is the way that you guys have done really good media campaigns and running candidates for presidency. That's really awesome. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's always for us, it's like a tactical decision, right? So you can, obviously we don't think that we're going to win, president of the United States. We don't think that, that's part of our, we're Leninists, so we don't have an illusion that we can, get state power through bourgeois mechanisms. But, it's basically if you look at it for, months and months, everyone is focused on the election. And so if you aren't intervening in that election, you can't really talk to the masses of people, and it's like this all the time. Whenever, all social movements in general subside before an election, just all energy is just sort of sucked away into the electoral cycle, and obviously there are still protests and cops are killing people, and there are responses to that. But in general, like sustained movements, there's an absence of that. So to intervene in the election is really like, I think it's a tactically wise decision.
Yeah, I really like the idea, especially like running a president under the assumption that that they're not going to win, and maybe you wouldn't even want to in a certain way. But specifically to like cash in on some of that social energy that's just in the air, that seems like really right to me. And I wonder how so there's been a lot of talk about how the Democratic Socialists of America are also kind of cashing in on that energy. And their membership is like tripling and quadrupling, whatever. And I wonder, like, what do you think is sort of a difference between something that the PSL does and something that, say, an organization like the DSA does?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely true that, like, in general, socialist organizations, left organizations, are like experiencing, a massive influx of interest, inquiry, participation. You can, like anyone pretty much can just organize like us. The other day, a couple weeks ago, we had like a study group for the Communist Manifesto. I'm in like rural Indiana, and like 15 people showed up, which is like. That's a lot of people who want to come and study the Communist Manifesto, like this thing that was written, 150 years ago. And so, that's definitely true, like across the board. And there's many differences between the Democratic Socialists of America and the PSL, or sort of any Marxist-Leninist party. They have to do both with vision and organization. So, in general, the DSA is. They've generally pursued an entryist strategy, which is basically, the idea that we should sort of build a, left base and enter into the Democratic Party, push it to the left, run our own candidates, because this is a sort of most viable mechanism for, social change. But they also, that's not exclusive. They also think that we should, build mass movements and coalitions and have protests and stuff like that. In general, historically, most of their energy has been towards, electoral campaigns. So, in general, they support the Democratic Party. This year, they didn't, officially endorse Hillary Clinton, but they didn't put anything out, really, that was critical of her. They sort of just focused all their energy on Trump, because apparently people didn't realize how horrible he was or something. I don't know. And then the other thing is that... to join the Democratic Socialists of America, all you have to do is go to their website and pay your dues. And then they send you a little packet, and you are officially a socialist organizer with the Democratic Socialists of America, which is, in general, that's a Democratic Socialist tradition, which is that you have these sort of mass parties with, little or no criteria for membership. And, the important thing is like having all these numbers or whatever. And so there's not really like a cohesive ideology. There's not really any discipline. Within the party, there's not really any centralization, and there's not any sort of like coherent outlook, orientation that endures throughout time, and that you can sort of track. And so, this can be a problem. I mean, this has historically been a problem. I think the sort of most famous case of it is in World War I, when there was the conference in Basel in I think 1911, in which all the Democratic Socialist parties of the Socialist International, which was the Second International, they met, and they knew that a world war was coming, an inter-imperialist war, and they all said, okay, we are all going to oppose this war, and for those of us with representatives in Parliament, we're going to vote against war credits, because we're not going to send workers of our country to kill workers of your country. And inevitably, when World War I came and the votes came up, every one of those parties, with the exception of the Bolsheviks and the Albanian communists, all of them voted for the war credits. And the reason is they had this material interest in it, because if they voted for the war credits, then they would be able to keep all their offices, they would be able to operate all their newspapers. They had a sort of material investment in the imperialist state that they didn't want to betray. And so, meanwhile, the Bolsheviks were driven underground. and isolated, completely demonized, thrown in jail, exiled to Siberia. If you read Stalin between 1914 and 1917 basically spends his entire time in Siberia, breaking out of Siberia, being sent back to Siberia. It's just a sort of endless cycle. But of course, if you look at history, where did the socialists win? And they won in Russia. They didn't win in Germany. They didn't win where there was a social democratic party. So I think that history sort of bears out the idea that social democracy is sort of a facade, and you can sort of win. It might help you make capitalism slightly better, but as we've seen, right, all those gains can be undone, and without an organization that's predicated upon and insists upon, the whole reason for the Communist Party is the actuality of revolution. That's how Lukács formulated it. He said that the party is founded on the actuality of revolution. And so I think without that without that orientation from the beginning, then mass struggles are inevitably going to be sort of reabsorbed within capitalism and within democracy. So I don't know, does that answer that question?
Yeah, for sure. That was a great history lesson, first of all. But taking a few steps back from that, I guess, I am a DSA member, and I joined in the height of post-election craziness, and I think your critique of DSA is pretty spot on, or at least it's what I've seen spot on. Definitely no real coherence between different geographical parties. Definitely a lack of discipline. And that all kind of comes out, I think, in the worst ways in social media. When a rogue DSA group will start talking about how they're not actually communists, or they're really social democrats or something like that. So I think that's a huge problem. Do you think that the PSL and the DSA can work together in any way, or do you think that the DSA is just sort of a lost cause?
Yeah, well, I definitely don't want to necessarily what I say about the DSA is, I think, correct. It's not meant to the PSL, we definitely don't see the DSA as we're really worried about fighting, the bourgeoisie, and, we have differences with the DSA, which we will always articulate, and which are, we don't even really need to. They're pretty clear, they're available. But, we do actually work together in different locations. So there is a lot of, connections, and in general, our orientation in the PSL is that, we definitely need a united front, especially in this contemporary period, so we are, willing to work with really, any groups on the left, and we have historically, formed united fronts with various organizations with which we have political differences. If we only worked with groups and individuals who had an identity of views with us, then we would only be working with ourselves all the time, and that wouldn't be effective or make any sense for movement building. So we always have to be seeking out alliances and coalitions, and that's a big priority of ours.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's very heartening to me, actually. Dean, based on this conversation, would you join the PSL?
Based on this conversation alone, I think I'm going to join the PSL. In all seriousness, I've been thinking about joining the PSL for a while, but I'm in part lazy and in part super busy. And also I live in Canada, so it's kind of complicated in that way. Yeah. But, I probably won't live here forever. So, yeah, it's on my horizon, but yeah, we're currently in a weird legal gray area because we're trying to be permanent residents here, but we're American citizens, so it actually makes party joining in both countries very difficult.
Yeah.
Maybe we could go back to, though, Derek, a little bit about Christians and their relationship to the left in general and communism specifically, because I know following the election there were a lot of disaffected Christians who joined the DSA, and it was a big thing. On Twitter, for example, I had all these Christian friends who were vaguely liberal or something, and sort of seeing Bernie Sanders and his campaign push them a little bit further in that direction, and they eventually joined the DSA. But now there's a kind of, I think maybe not quite despair on the one hand, and maybe not quite like fervent arbitrary activism on the other, but something in the middle of those two things, like people feel like there's kind of something you should be doing, but like it's not clear what, and it's not clear why it would matter, but you're joining these different organizations and you're trying to, get the conversation going. Do you think that joining like a party like the PSL or something like that would help to solve some of those problems or give some direction to people who are feeling that kind of tension?
Yeah, well, I think it's similar to like an individual who is going through, a crisis, like a personal crisis or some trauma or some like serious life change, who is looking for some spiritual guidance or spiritual nourishment. And so they just go to like the nearest church or the nearest mosque or the nearest synagogue or, the nearest like Buddhist retreat center. Right. And that's like their sort of entryway. Like, okay, what's the most like apparent, like, let me Google socialism, or let me Google like spirituality, and like I'm just gonna Yelp it and see what the reviews are and go see who's like checked into the most places, and so I think that like it's not uncommon like for for people who are like, oh man, I really want to like do something, get involved, like make a change, and I definitely don't want to join the Democratic Party, which is definitely a good positive development, to do something like join this. But the thing is it like is, as you identified, right, like we need some direction, and also we're not like when I entered the movement, it's not like I was I had to start it, right? I mean, I joined a party because there was this history, this historical and collective experience that was embodied in it, and that guided it, and that I was like I absorbed, and that then I contributed to in turn, and I think that that's like that's important. One of the things that the party does is it provides direction for individuals and for mass movements. It's like it's what kind of like shifts the gears in social struggles in many ways. And so I do think that joining whatever sort of like disciplined revolutionary party that aligns with your ideology, that is where you are, or that you want to start where you are, is a good thing to do. If you are willing to dedicate yourself to the struggle and sort of discipline yourself and sacrifice for it, because not everyone has to be a party member, not everyone has to be a party organizer. There's roles for everyone to play in the struggle. So I would never say to someone who like doesn't have the time, or like the resources, or the sort of like whatever kind of capital you need to like start a party branch or something like that. Like there's always a role to play, and like you don't necessarily need to join a party, but you can become like friendly with a party, and like trust me, we will give you something to do. We will put you to use towards like an end that you will agree with.
Maybe we could talk about that, toward an end that you would agree with. So we started out talking a little bit about communism as building the kingdom of God on earth. And I think that's a really helpful way of like building some shared vocabulary between Christians and communists. And I wonder, historically there are a lot of in some ways earned and in some ways unearned stereotypes about enmity between communism and Christians or people of other faith traditions. And what do you think are some of the sources for those conflicts? And then also, how do you think there might be ways that communists and people of faith today might not be oppositional groups, but could, be working toward the same kind of goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely like, as you said, it's not like it's that sort of, the idea that there's a tension between the two is without any historical base. There's definitely a material base for that. And I think that, it's something that there's also a lot of misunderstanding about what actual like positions have been of communist parties and in communist states. A lot of that has, been alleviated. The Pope has visited communist countries, and there are Catholic churches and many churches in communist countries. Many, there's actually a plurality of religious worship that takes place in Cuba, for example, The state is actually building a mosque right now in Havana. But the other hand, right, like I said, there's also been a lot of misunderstanding. I mean, for example, Lenin, who we should go to in many ways when we're talking about communism and implementing it. Lenin always held that religion was like in contradiction with socialism, dialectical materialism, and historical materialism, but actually felt that it was like you should not be like a militant atheist, and actually said that the workers' parties should not explicitly proclaim atheism. And this goes back even Engels. Engels is really critical of certain parties like militant atheism, saying that that's actually like a terrible thing, and that's like not only is it counterproductive to have like a political war on religion, but it's like religion is a private matter. It was the line was Engels' line and was Lenin's line, and of course I think that obviously religious people might disagree with the idea that it's a private matter, right? Because religion is a social thing. But that was just kind of a way that they were trying to manage that contradiction. But I think that like in the PSL, for example, we have people of many faiths. We have atheists, but we also have people of many different faiths. We have Muslim comrades, Christian comrades, Catholic comrades, Jewish comrades that actually see, they see that their religious convictions and their political convictions really cohabitate, and more than that, really like feed off of each other. That their commitment to one sort of vindicates and amplifies their commitment to the other.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's kind of how I feel. Or this is what Dean and I have talked about in previous weeks, that there's a definite confluence between the social action of Christianity and the project of communism. I think that there's a definite connection there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like being a party member, being a communist, even if you're not in a party, is that's being a good steward. That's like using using what God has given you towards like the sort of most just end.
Oh man, you definitely hang around enough Christians if you're using stewardship language, like positively. That was a good Christian buzzword. I wonder too if we could talk a little bit about like some anxieties that Christians have about communism as a result of those misunderstandings, and especially some of these come from like questions we got on social media, and I thought it would be good to address them. For example, like. Is religion a threat to communism, right? We kind of addressed that a little bit. It seems like no, but the things you hear in the press, especially in the West, are things like, Mao getting rid of the Dalai Lama and trying to push them all into India and out of Tibet, or in Russia, you hear about, problems with the Orthodox Church, and in Latin America, there's a complicated sort of relationship with Catholicism. So maybe you could like speak to a little bit about that. Why might religious people feel threatened by communism, and why should they not?
Yeah. Well, I think that I would say that religious institutions that like adhere to the capitalist model and support capitalism definitely should be afraid of communism, right? Like mega churches that that are basically like expropriation schemes, right? Probably would not fare well under communism, right? Or like for example, the Dalai Lama, right? I mean, the Dalai Lama in Tibet that was like. The rule of the lamas was like, they were feudal, like lords. There was like slavery under the lamas in Tibet. There was intense like repression of women, sort of social relations that were at complete odds with the communist project, and that had to be, like ultimately overthrown, right? And so the People's Liberation Army had to liberate Tibet from the lamas and force the Dalai Lama into exile, and the Dalai Lama has done quite well in exile, right? He's earned millions of dollars from the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, and gets I don't even know what his fees are for speaking engagements, but he's rewarded quite handsomely for his peaceful, proclamations. But of course, interestingly enough, though, right, the Dalai Lama came out like a couple years ago and was like, "Oh, I'm really a socialist," right? And I think that, to me, that speaks to like the fact that like the popularity of socialism and how much sense it makes. Is even this person who's like actually, like who was overthrown by socialists has had to say like, "Oh yeah, I'm a socialist," to sort of appeal to the young people today. So there's that. I mean, I would definitely say that like that's churches that collaborate, like any institution that collaborates with imperialism and with capitalism, definitely does actually have something to lose from communism. Now, that's not to say that the individuals associated with those institutions have anything to lose from communism, and that their interests are at all misaligned or disaligned with the communist project. And I would say that that's, unless they are members of the 1%, then it's going to be true that they're going to benefit from communism. If they're members of the 1%, then they also might benefit from communism. They might not think they're benefiting from it, right? But we don't always realize when we are undergoing a process of humanization, and we don't always think that process of humanization is humanizing while we're undergoing it.
That kind of leads into another question I guess we got from Twitter, and I think that's a real sticking point for like leftist-ish Christians. That there's let's see. So communism has like an obvious history with revolution and sometimes revolutionary violence, and that is a rub for Christianity and for Christians a ton. So I wonder what you might say about that. Like, if you're a communist, are you committed to certain acts of violence or certain understandings of violence that might be in conflict with Christianity?
I would say that. I think that as a communist, my primary duty is to combat violence. Right. So we are committed to alleviating and ideally ridding the daily violence of capitalist exploitation in the workplace, the violence of white supremacy and racism, the violence of misogyny and patriarchy, the violence of ableism, nationalism and xenophobia, transphobia, anti-LGBT, anti-queer bigotry, that those very real deadly violences that have killed, and continue to kill and maim so many people, that's really the violence that we're committed to ending. There's, if you think about all the people who have died as a result of overproduction under capitalism, as a result of low wages, food, of hunger, of lacking, and not only those who have died, but those who suffer on a daily basis from food insecurity, from homelessness, home insecurity, from low wages, from police violence. That's really the violence that we're combating, and we're dedicated to combating, and ultimately, like I said, alleviating and eradicating that. Now, the process through which that is eradicated is never, let's say, pretty. It's never the result of dialogue and deliberation. And I think that if you look, that's just kind of the way it goes. If you look at any historical struggle, any real social gain has never been the result of cooperation, right? Slave owners didn't willingly give up their slaves and their plantations. They were forced to do that. And that's the sort of, way that it's always gone. So I would say that, our main thing is we're committed to resisting and eradicating violence and creating a peaceful world. And we want to do that through, the means that make the most sense and the means that are going to be the most effective.
Yeah, I think that type of approach to violence has been something we've talked about in previous episodes, and something that I think is important for Christians to understand, that violence isn't just this one solitary act of one person attacking another person or something, right? That it's something systemic and larger than just one social situation. I think that's a really helpful understanding of violence.
Yeah, I think
go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, Derek. Yeah, so one place that this conversation showed up for Matt and I was in an episode we did about Jacques Ellul, who's a Christian anarchist. And for Ellul, his anarchism stems from his Christianity, which he thinks is inherently nonviolent. But it's really strange because, as we talked about in the episode, it gets him in all these really weird binds. Like, he never really talks about what violence is. He never really talks about what anarchism is. He kind of talks about what Christianity is, but it's not very clear. And yeah, I wonder, like, do you think there's something about, for example, like, that anxiety about violence in general that leads to positions that are even, like, they take themselves to be sort of on the left, but they're not quite thought through. Like, that seems to me to be the kind of DSA gamble in a certain way, for better and worse, insofar as it appeals to people, right? That they're not like a violent organism, so they're out there, making a softer appeal in a way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, of course, the PSL is not a violent organism, and
sure,
right. And I don't think any revolutionary parties in the United States are or would aspire to be. It's never historically, right? The sort of the party doesn't make a revolution, right? The masses make the revolution, and the party is the sort of organization that solidifies that revolution and that ensures its success, right? That continues it, that manages the contradictions of it through the participation of the masses. And so, yeah, I think that this idea that that violence is only a subjective act that individuals perpetuate against another individual is a misnomer, right? And it's almost like a red herring, right? Because I don't know if you think about. I mean, for one, there's actually never been a purely nonviolent movement that we could ever actually even refer to, right? Nonviolence, I think, is it's a tactic, and I think it's a tactic that should be deployed when it makes tactical sense to deploy it. You can't look at the movements that are heralded as like nonviolent movements, like the civil rights movement in the United States, actually had an armed wing throughout the entire time. I mean, if you were in the South organizing, and if you were black and you were organizing with other black people, you had to have guns, right? Because the Ku Klux Klan would kill you, right? They would come and ambush you and kill you. So you had to defend yourself. And there's a really good book on this, Negroes with Guns. It's actually a documentary about it. I don't know if people have access to Canopy. It's like the educational Netflix. But anyways, yeah, Negroes with Guns, excellent documentary about this. And so you can't sort of disentangle, right? The urban insurrections in the early 60s, the late 60s from the social programs that were won and the social and civil rights that were run. You can't say it was just this nonviolent march that did it all, right? It's sort of impossible to tease that out. Same thing with the struggle in India, right? Which had an armed had a military wing. Same thing with the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, which had a really important armed military wing to it, which is heralded as a nonviolent thing, but there were nonviolent tactics deployed, but it wasn't a nonviolent struggle. And if you look at the outcome of those struggles, we all say that that's a good thing. It's a good thing that South Africa is not under an apartheid regime. It's a good thing that today black people de facto in the United States, or de jure, I should say, have a right to vote and have a right to participate fully in society. And to say that that's a good thing and to say that you support the movement that brought that about isn't to say that one is violent, right, or one endorses violence. I think it's violence. I think it's actually to say that one pursues, is dedicated to the ideals of a nonviolent and peaceful world and a just world.
Yeah, I like that a lot, especially because it kind of just forces us to think a lot more about what we mean by violence, which is a word that has a lot of cultural currency, but not a lot of actual clarity. So I think that's, a good thing to keep pushing. If we can talk actually a little bit about, we haven't talked about your book at all, or your work in pedagogy. And as a way in, we got this great question on Twitter where somebody asked, what does Marxist education look like for children? And how can church education benefit from a Marxist perspective, specifically for youth? So, Derek, what would a Marxist youth group or a Marxist Sunday school look like?
I'll say that there's, I'll tell you that what a socialist Sunday school might look like, and then I'll tell you what a communist Sunday school might look like. And I'll do this. I'll tell you that of the real differences in educational programs between the socialists and the communists in the early 20th century in the United States. Socialist youth groups were study groups, pretty much. They were educational study groups, and the activities that they would engage in would be to fundraise for the party, to fundraise for strikes. So the youth were seen as future revolutionaries, as future workers. The communist youth groups were just youth versions of the party and of party organizations. So they would not only study, but they were not future communists and future workers. They were workers and they were communists, and so they were fighters too. They had a stake in the struggle. Their stake in the struggle wasn't because they were the children of their parents. It was because they were workers, human beings that existed in the world. So I would say that a Marxist study group, and this is not to talk about the pedagogy of it, right? But it's sort of like its reason to be would be to realize the humanity of the child and their stake in the world as it exists today and the future that we will ideally be around for.
So that's like a really interesting explanation, I guess, of those differences. Something I never really considered, probably. Though when you're explaining these things, what I find fascinating is that my experience in like an evangelical church is probably more similar to a communist youth group than anything else.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, we're all as like teenagers and younger than that even. We're there and we have actual stakes in the world, and we're all actors, not in relation to our parents, but into relation to our own like sort of salvation and that kind of thing. So that like form, I think, actually exists in churches already. It's just the content that might be off.
Yeah, interesting. There's a book called Raising Reds by Paul Michelin. And it's about radical education in the 20th century. So if people are interested in it, that's kind of where I get some of the stuff about the differences between the socialist and the communist youth groups. And the other thing is that a lot of the socialist groups actually were because the socialist community, and a lot of the communist community was all Eastern European, primarily European and recent immigrants, and so they actually had like socialist Sunday schools that would be attached to churches and to synagogues. Like that was a place where radical left would congregate, because that's where they're sort of culturally and ethnically grouped.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That makes sense too, of both the ways in which I think communism and Christianity are sort of global phenomenons in interesting ways that leads them to participate together differently in different parts of the world. We talked a little bit before in the last episode about in places like the Philippines, for example, like Catholics and communists became so incredibly enmeshed and close in a way that Catholics in the United States or in Canada, apart from maybe like Quebec, would find like totally unimaginable. Like that wouldn't make any sense. But it's interesting that, as a global phenomenon, like the kind of religious experience that you find among oppressed folks, especially via imperialism, tends to look a bit different than it does in the centers of power, I think.
This is a huge question with no, I don't know. I think it's a big question at least. But it definitely goes back to the question about parties and giving people some direction. But Derek, I wonder what you would say the biggest obstacle to the realization of communism in America might be.
Yeah, definitely a big question, an important one. I think that there are two. So I will not answer your question. I will answer a different question, which is what are the two most?
Some good pedagogy.
Right.
Yeah. And that is white supremacy and imperialism. I think that the legacy of white supremacy in the United States has played an incredibly debilitating role in mass movements. in that, white masses have historically been won over to the side of the bourgeoisie through racism and through benefits of, white privilege. Of course, today, though, capitalism isn't able to provide as many privileges to white people as it was, let's say, in the 1950s. But nonetheless, obviously, white privilege is a thing. And, it's not just a material thing, it's also an ideological thing and an outlook thing. And it's related to the second problem of imperialism or national chauvinism. And this relates to the ways in which mass movements and revolutionary sort of ideology can be blunted through our investments in an imperialist state and in national chauvinism. So, for example, there were massive, militant protests against the World Trade Organization and the IMF in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Those were completely annihilated, through 9/11 and Bush's response to it. Bush's response, his approval rating after the weeks of 9/11 were 90-something%, and the entire left, almost the entire left, I will say, retreated, and we're hanging American flags on their websites and in their offices and saying we're all Americans today, and totally united with the bourgeoisie, with their class enemy, because they believed that their national interests were superior to their class interests. And this happens, all the time. I mean, this is why it's important for communists to combat racism and to combat this sort of racist propaganda against places like Syria, against places like the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, against places like Venezuela, against places like Iran, because it's when there's this strange way in where we sort of unite, and all of a sudden it's indistinguishable. On my Facebook page, it's indistinguishable whether these people are watching Fox News or whether they're socialists or anarchists, because they're saying the exact same propaganda against Syria or against Kim Jong-un. And so I think that those two things, and of course a lot of propaganda is also racist, orientalist, and so on and so forth. So one of the things that we in the PSL and in my own work in organizing, we always forefront anti-imperialism and anti-racism, anti-white supremacy.
So that leads me to another sort of question. So I have some fantastic students who are always about 3 or 4 steps ahead of me on social issues, because that's just the way things go. And they're really committed to things like Black Lives Matter and the struggles of Indigenous people, and I admire them so much for taking those things up. But what I see is that they're interested in investing in these movements, but they can't quite make that connection between those movements of anti-racism and anti-white supremacy and anti-nationalism to like a socialism or to a communism. What would you say to those movements? How do we connect to those things?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that I think definitely Black Lives Matter. Also the Indigenous movement are really good about in different ways and at different levels, different stages, about proposing a vision, right? So you can only fight police brutality so long until you come up against the idea of the state and against capitalism, right? Because it's you can't really combat police brutality effectively without asking, well, what exactly are the police protecting and whose interests are they serving, right? And the answer to that is obviously they're protecting the interests of private property and of capital. And, you also see the connection with look at the struggles around the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is clearly, driven by the profit motive, by capital. And then you see the police, and the army, right, repressing people, and they are defending the interests of these oil barons against the interests of the people. And so I think that in many ways, it's just a matter of sort of articulating those struggles and of joining them together. And really, one of the tasks of the party is to serve as a conduit for the communication and cooperation of those struggles, and so that the leaderships of those struggles are connected with organizations that are not only in a defensive mode but also in an offensive mode, fighting for a vision of a new society, and asking the questions like, okay, what would a society without police protecting private property look like? How would we get there? so that we're not constantly just sort of in a response mode to, the latest attack from Capitol or from the police. So I don't know, is that helpful? Like, in thinking about how to explain that? I mean, in some ways it's just like the articulations are there to be made.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful, and I guess that does just implicitly make the idea of the party that much more important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the thing is that struggles come and go, and they ebb and flow, right? Yeah. So, for example, like we right now, I think on the left need to be focused about the day-to-day struggles, but we also need to be focused about 5 years out. If there's a Democrat in office, right? Like, how do we solidify? Like, it's great that we can get all these people to our meetings right now, and all these people might want to like give us money and like sign up to be members. But how do we make sure that in 5 years they're still fighting and they're still organizing and they're still just as committed today as they are in 5 years? Like that's the real question. Yeah. Like, can we solidify these gains?
Thanks, Derek. That's awesome. That's super helpful for my own life, not just for my podcast life.
Cool. I'm glad.
So, Derek, we opened this episode with a short clip from a guy named Alex Jones from InfoWars. I don't know if you're familiar with this brilliant sage of our time. But anyway, he he is very worried that the Pope is a new Lenin. He thinks that the Pope is trying to be a new Marx, and I wonder what you think of that as we close our episode here. What does it mean for someone like Alex Jones to worry that Pope Francis is like so radical that he might be Vladimir Lenin?
Yeah, it's interesting because it expresses like both. It expresses like this paranoia, but also like a diagnosis of the times, right? Which is that like there is definitely like a polarization that's going on, and I think that I don't know. I mean, my read of the Pope is that he is part of that polarization. Like, to talk about bringing humanity together is to like polarize, right? Because there are people who precisely do not want to bring humanity together, and so I don't know. Like, I mean, I am interested in that. I like that. I mean, obviously, like, many people on the left have critiques about the Pope because it's like, yeah, you can talk a big game, but where's the action or whatever? But the reality is, like, I will tell you what. When the U.S. was trying to first invade Syria in 2013, 2014, the Pope got millions of people out into the streets to protest that, which was awesome. Like, I am all for that. I think that I don't think the Pope is a Lenin of our times, but I think that if he can move people towards Lenin, then that is definitely an excellent thing. And maybe we can one day credit Alex Jones with being the first person to predict that social phenomenon.
That would be great.
Yeah, thanks, Alex Jones. I'm glad he's winning the InfoWars, I guess.
I know. Well, we actually will probably just erase him from the history textbooks altogether. But
that's also okay.
Yeah, but we'll never know about the gay frogs or their fate. So I don't know if that's so wise, Derek.
Pizzagate.
Yeah. Nothing of value was lost there. I don't think so. Just
some time. Oh my God! When I found that out, like I just found out about that, like when there was that protest, and I wasted like 2 hours, like on Twitter, just like in total shock and total disbelief that this was like a real thing.
Yeah.
And, oh my gosh! I wish I could have that time back and that like experience back.
You talking about Pizzagate?
Back. Yeah.
The craziest thing to me about Pizzagate is, so like obviously this guy is insane and awful, but at the end of the day, like, kudos for actually doing something about the fact that he thinks that people are like actually, like running a sex ring, because you just have to imagine like how many people in America actually believed like the Pizzagate stories, but then just like stayed at home and like shared it on their Facebook. Like, apparently they don't care that much about sex trafficking to like do anything about it. So maybe we should take a lesson from this this radical anti-Clintonite.
Yeah, but on the other hand, it's like why wouldn't you like organize a protest against like child exploitation, like based on evidence that like everyone agrees on, you know what I mean, and that like is real,
right? Like that evidence is real. Everyone has it. Like it's not like a conspiracy.
Yeah, so that's kind of weird. Like I definitely understand what you're saying. Like like take some initiative for sure, and expose yourself too, in the meantime, right? Because you can't, it's like, get out there and start talking, because then, we know what's really up. I
should be clear. I don't support the the lone gunman walking into a pizza shop, having not been educated. Yes, this is also a good reason for having parties.
Yeah, good. I'll put that disclaimer in my notes for your pre-application membership file I'm keeping right now.
Thank you.
I don't know.
That's very important to me.
I don't know if you guys saw it, but on Twitter there was some pictures from the Pizzagate protest, and they're like little kids wearing shirts that said "I am not a pizza," and deeply disturbing, like really heartbroken for those kids. On the other hand, those are very funny shirts. I know. Context.
There was one young kid who had a sign that said, like, "If you see me with John Podesta, call the police."
That's right. Oh my gosh. Poor kid. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of what that home life is like. Very weird.
I know. Yeah. True. But at least people are, at least protesting is like a normal thing that even like people who are like totally unhinged do.
Yeah, literally, at the very least, that is it.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thanks so much, Derek, for chatting with us. This was really fun, and I hope that some Christian folks start exploring things like the PSL and ways to get involved, and hopefully they'll see you out there.
Yeah. Well, it was super fun. Thank you. You guys also have really good podcast voice.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, I'm serious. It's cool. Like, I feel like I'm like listening to a podcast when I listen to you talk, which is cool.
That's what we want. That's the aesthetic we're going for.
Yeah, it's good. Well, you're nailing it.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast, and thanks for sending your questions to Derek. It was a really good show because of all of the effort you put in. Yay! So keep tweeting us your questions and ideas for future episodes of Magnificast. I think that's a good way to generate things for us to talk about. Also, shout out to Burrell, Jacob, Matt, Sheepherd, My Oklahoma Home, and Ellen Koenig for getting us over 100 followers on Twitter. It's a really huge milestone. Also, don't forget to subscribe, follow, 5-star, thumbs up, slam dunk, friend, tumble, or donate to your favorite charities in the name of the Magnificast on iTunes and Stitcher. Alright, thanks for listening.
Church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up, keep your hoods up, and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up, well, you keep your hoods up, and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Besides, what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was glowing in the lights of the downtown. Saw a spark in your eyes, I just spoke it. Said we're gonna turn this whole place upside down. Then you said, my dear, do you really mean this? I said, I only know what I feel right now. I said, poet lies, sometime come true. Stay awake with me, where see what we can do. Poet lies, sometime come true. Stay awake with me, where see what we can do in my town. For church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down.